There are moments in history so powerful, so deeply human, they transcend time, stories that reach across centuries and grip our hearts as if they happened yesterday. Picture this: a candle flickers in a dimly lit cottage, its faint glow revealing the tear-streaked face of a woman holding a piece of parchment. The ink is faded, the edges frayed, but the words are unmistakable. Her son, the boy she last saw as a child marching off to war, is alive. After years of silence, after a decade of mourning, hope has returned. This isn't just a scene from a story book, it's a reality countless medieval families lived through, their lives shattered by conflict and then, against all odds, stitched back together by miracles of reunion. War in the Middle Ages didn't just reshape kingdoms, it tore families apart, scattering children, parents, and siblings across battlefields and borders. The Crusades, the 100 Years' War, the endless clashes of empires, these weren't just conflicts of swords and shields. They were human tragedies, leaving behind a trail of broken homes and unanswered questions. But amid the chaos, there were flashes of light, letters that found their way home, travelers who carried news of lost loved ones, chance encounters in crowded marketplaces that turned despair into joy. These reunions weren't just lucky breaks, they were testaments to the unyielding force of love and determination, proof that even in the darkest times, people refused to let go of hope. Why do these stories still move us today? Perhaps because they remind us of something timeless, the idea that no matter how far we're separated, no matter how long the silence, the bonds of family can endure. In a world where war and displacement still tear lives apart, these medieval tales echo with a startling relevance. They're not just history, they're mirrors reflecting our own deepest fears and greatest hopes. So let's step into the past together, walking the dusty roads these families walked, feeling their heartache and their joy. Because their stories aren't just about them, they're about us, about what it means to lose, to hope, and to find our way back to one another. The medieval battlefield was a place of unimaginable chaos, a storm of clashing steel, screaming horses, and the sickening thud of arrows finding their mark. But the true cost of war wasn't just measured in blood spilled on the field. It echoed in the smoldering ruins of villages left behind, in the faces of mothers clutching children as they fled into the unknown, in the hollow silence of homes where a son or husband once laughed. Armies moved like wildfires, swallowing up boys as young as 13, ripped from their families with no chance to say goodbye. Chroniclers of the time wrote of entire regions left empty of men, with fields untended and hearths gone cold. One account from the 100 Years' War describes a French village where only the elderly and infants remained, every able-bodied man gone, either dead or marched off to fight under a banner they barely understood. The randomness of conscription made the grief even sharper. A knock at the door, a shouted order from a passing knight, and just like that, a family could be shattered. There were no letters home, no muster rolls to check, only the unbearable weight of not knowing. Imagine a father staring at the road for years, straining for any glimpse of a familiar face, while his wife whispered prayers to saints who seemed to have stopped listening. For every soldier who fell in battle, countless others simply vanished, captured, deserted, or lost in the fog of war. Some families held funerals without bodies, others refused to give up hope, clinging to stories of survivors who stumbled home years later, half dead but alive. And yet, amid this relentless devastation, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, ordinary people clung to fragile threads of connection. A traveling merchant who might carry word, a wounded soldier who recognized a name. These weren't just strokes of luck, they were acts of defiance against the crushing machinery of war. Because in a world where everything could be taken in an instant, the stubborn belief that loved ones might still be out there became a kind of rebellion. And when, against all odds, that belief was rewarded, those were the moments that lit up the darkest corners of history. In an age before instant messages or even reliable roads, the distance between a soldier and his family wasn't just measured in miles. It was a gulf of silence, broken only by the rare and fragile thread of a handwritten letter. Sending word home in the Middle Ages was a gamble at best. Messengers faced bandits lurking in forests, roads washed out by storms, or simply the cruel arithmetic of war. A single skirmish could erase the lone traveler carrying precious words from the front. And even if a letter survived the journey, there was no guarantee it would find its intended recipient. Villages emptied by war, families displaced by hunger, names misspelled by scribes, so many ways for hope to dissolve before it reached its destination. Consider the staggering cost of sending even a single page. Parchment was expensive, ink a luxury, and hiring a messenger required coin most peasant families didn't have. A farmer might trade a month's worth of eggs just to send a few lines to his son, praying the messenger wouldn't abandon the task or pocket the payment. Some letters were entrusted to pilgrims or merchants heading in the right direction, passed hand to hand like whispered secrets. Others were tucked into the satchels of knights or monks, their delivery dependent on the whims of men who might forget or fall in battle before fulfilling their promise. One heartbreaking account from the Crusades tells of a mother in Normandy who paid a traveling friar to carry a letter to her son in Jerusalem. She waited 7 years for a reply, only to learn the friar had died en route. Her words never delivered, her son left wondering if she'd forgotten him. In another case, a knight's last letter to his wife reached her 3 years after his death, the ink smudged by rain, the seal broken by some unknown hand along the way. She'd already remarried, believing him lost forever. These weren't just delays, they were heartbreaks layered upon heartbreaks. Yet sometimes, against all odds, a letter defied the chaos. A merchant might recognize a name, a wounded soldier might recall a face, and suddenly, a scrap of parchment became a lifeline. In the 1200s, a Flemish weaver received word that his brother, missing for a decade after the Battle of Bouvines, was alive in a French prison. The message had traveled through 6 hands carried by a wool trader, a nun, and a ransom negotiator. By the time the weaver scraped together the money to free his brother, the man had already died of fever. But the letter had reached him in time for one final reply. "Tell my family I remembered them every day." That fragile piece of paper, stained with tears and travel, became the family's most treasured relic. This was the cruel irony of medieval communication. The very rarity of these reunions made them burn brighter. Every letter that survived, every messenger who kept his word, was a small defiance against the darkness of war. And when a soldier did stagger home, his clothes in tatters but a crumpled letter still tucked inside his shirt, that wasn't just luck, it was a miracle written in ink and sealed with stubborn hope. The story of Sir William de Montfort reads like something from a minstrel's ballad, except every word is true. In the autumn of 1392, his family in Herefordshire held a funeral without a body. For 5 long years, they'd clung to rumors a squire who swore he saw William fall at the siege of Vilnius, a merchant who claimed to have spotted a man with his scars in a Lithuanian prison. But as the seasons turned without word, even his wife began draping her gowns in black. Then, on a night when the wind howled like a grieving spirit, a figure staggered through the manor gates. His beard was matted, his left eye milky with blindness, but when he rasped his youngest daughter's childhood nickname, Little Finch, the household erupted in tears. Medieval chronicles overflow with such impossible homecomings. The Chronica Majora tells of a French knight who returned after 16 years. His face so weathered his own mother didn't recognize him until he produced the silver ring she'd hidden in his swaddling clothes. Even more haunting are the ballad songs like The Black Knight's Return, where a warrior greets his aged parents with the line, "Do you still keep a place at your table for the boy who left with the spring lambs?" These weren't just poetic flourishes, they captured the raw, disorienting joy of reunions where time itself seemed to unravel. What made William's survival extraordinary wasn't just the battles he'd endured, it was the chain of miracles that guided him home. Captured by Teutonic knights, he'd been sold to a Lithuanian nobleman as a laborer. When he finally escaped, he walked across Europe with nothing but the faded memory of river crossings his father had once described. A Flemish wool trader took pity and let him work passage to England. By then, his lands had been reassigned, his children taught to call another man father. Yet the moment he knelt in the parish church, the same spot where he'd sworn his knightly vows, the priest gasped and sent for the family. The records from Hereford Cathedral preserve his wife's reaction in startling detail. She touched his face as one who fears a ghost, then clutched him so fiercely her nails drew blood. That single line captures the duality of these reunions, the dizzying blend of elation and anguish, because homecoming wasn't an ending, it was a reckoning. The man who returned wasn't the boy who'd left. War had carved new lines in his face and darker hollows in his stories. Some nights, his children would find him staring into the hearth, whispering names of comrades who hadn't been as lucky. But in a world where so many never came back at all, his story became a beacon. Neighbors traveled for miles just to see the resurrected knight, as if his presence proved that even in the bleakest of times, the fates could still spare a glimmer of mercy. And perhaps that's why these tales were preserved with such reverence, not just as personal triumphs, but as proof that sometimes, against every cruel odd, the thread of a family's story could be rewoven. For families left behind in the shadow of war, the hardest wound wasn't always grief, it was uncertainty. Imagine a mother kneeling by the same window every evening, lighting a candle not for prayer, but as a beacon. "Let it guide him home," she'd whisper, though years had passed since her son marched away. In villages across Europe, these flickering lights became silent screams against the dark, a ritual so common that some towns passed ordinances limiting how long candles could burn, fearing fires from unattended flames. The historian Thomas of Burton wrote of a Lincolnshire woman who kept her taper lit for 19 years, refusing to believe her husband had fallen at Cressy until a blind beggar stumbled into town with his helmet. Children bore a different kind of scar. Boys who'd last seen their fathers as towering figures in chainmail grew into men themselves, their memories fraying like old tapestry threads. Court records from York tell of a baker's son who, at 25, still asked travelers if they'd met a man with his father's laugh. Girls inherited their mother's restless habits, checking the road at dusk, flinching at the sound of hooves. In one heartbreaking deposition, a widow described her daughter keeping a doll dressed in scraps of her father's tunic, whispering to it each night as if the rag could conjure him back. To cope, families turned to rituals that blurred faith and desperation. Pilgrims left worn-out shoes at roadside shrines, a symbolic offering for travelers' safe returns. In Brittany, mothers baked soldiers' bread on feast days, loaves shaped like shields, said to strengthen absent men in battle. Some consulted cunning folk who read omens in bird flights or floating candles, while others clung to ghost stories, tales of spectral knights who returned just long enough to kiss their sleeping children. These weren't just superstitions, they were lifelines. When the Bishop of Winchester scolded his flock for pagan practices, a woman famously retorted, God may know where my boy is, but he won't tell me. The cruelest twist, sometimes hope was more painful than closure. Chroniclers noted cases where families, upon finally receiving confirmation of a death, seemed almost relieved, not because they'd stopped loving, but because the agonizing limbo had ended. A 15th century Florentine diary captures this perfectly. Today we buried Giovanni's cloak in the family crypt. Better a grave with no bones than a heart with no peace. Yet even then, some refused to let go. Archaeologists still find medieval graves with empty coffin spaces left beside spouses, just in case, because in a world where letters crumbled and messengers vanished, the line between faith and denial was as thin as candlelight against the night. The merchant Emeric of Toulouse had a knack for numbers, a skill that saved his life when his city fell to siege in 1422. While knights perished in the breach, his ability to calculate ransoms in 3 languages caught the attention of an invading captain. Instead of chains, he was given a choice: serve as the army's quartermaster or watch his family's shop burn. For 5 years, he tallied supplies for the men who'd shattered his home, clinging to one fragile hope, that his wife and daughters had escaped the sacking. But in a world without maps or postal routes, how does a man find 4 specific souls among millions? Emeric's quest began with ink and parchment. Wealth opened doors barred to peasants. He bribed clerks to search tax rolls, hired scribes to pen letters to every trading guild from Genoa to Bruges. One reply arrived from a Venetian spice dealer. A woman matching your description purchased saffron here last Lent. The lead was 2 years old, but it lit a fire under him. He negotiated his release by promising the enemy commander a cut of future profits, then embarked on a journey that would make Odysseus pause. Class didn't just ease his search, it dictated its very possibility. While a farmer's family might vanish into the anonymity of refugee hordes, a merchant's connections left traces. Guild records noted his wife's request for credit in Marseille. A customs log listed his eldest daughter boarding a ship to Naples. Each clue cost coin bribes to officials, fees to copy civic records, payments to messengers willing to brave bandit-infested roads. At one point, Emeric paid a forger to create false death certificates for himself, hoping the grim news would lure his family out of hiding. The breakthrough came through sheer absurdity. While auditing a textile shipment in Valencia, he overheard 2 weavers gossiping about the Frenchwoman who darns stockings like a magician. His wife's signature stitch, a double loop knot taught by her grandmother, was as unique as a fingerprint. Rushing to the shop, he found her mending hose in the back room, their daughters now teenagers who spoke Catalan better than Occitan. The reunion was less a tearful embrace than a stunned silence. "You smell like gunpowder," his wife finally said, touching his sleeve where army rations had left permanent stains. Their story exposes the brutal arithmetic of medieval reunions: money multiplied hope. A peasant family might wait decades for a chance encounter. A merchant could buy shortcuts, yet even wealth couldn't erase the scars. Emeric's ledgers from those years show bizarre entries: paid to a seer for dream of Marie's face, 3 florins to a sailor who claimed to hear Margot's laugh in Bordeaux. The desperation beneath the transactions chills the blood, because no matter how full your purse, war robbed everyone of certainty. You could purchase 100 clues and still never know if the next doorway would reveal your child or another crushing mirage. When Emeric's family finally reunited in a cramped Valencia apartment, his wife refused to burn the fake death certificates. "Proof the world lies," she said, tucking them into their Bible. That parchment became their private sacrament, a reminder that in an age when empires rose and fell on whims, love required not just patience, but the grit to outwit chaos itself. War spared no one, not even those too small to lift a sword. Among the most haunting casualties of medieval conflict were the children left behind when armies swept through. Some were orphaned in burning villages, others snatched as spoils of war, their tiny hands pried from their mothers' skirts as captors carried them off to foreign lands. Monasteries became accidental orphanages, their gates swelling with boys and girls who arrived with no names, only blank stares and tattered clothes. Chroniclers wrote of abbots baptizing foundlings as John found by the oak or Mary of the ashes, wiping away old identities like footprints in the rain. One gut-wrenching account from the Saxon Wars describes a nun discovering a toddler clutching a charred doll in the ruins of a convent, her entire family slaughtered by raiders. The abbess named her Ember and raised her among the cloister's roses, never knowing the child's real name was Gisela, daughter of a Frisian blacksmith. For every such child, a family somewhere scraped at the earth with bare hands, desperate for any sign. A father might spend years tracking rumors of blue-eyed boys sold to Venetian slavers, while a mother bribed travelers to ask after a daughter with a strawberry birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Yet sometimes fate spun threads of light through the darkness. In the 12th century, a knight touring a Flemish monastery froze mid-step when he spotted a kitchen boy's earlobe. It bore the same peculiar notch as his brother, lost in a Norman raid 15 years prior. The boy remembered nothing but the taste of salt water and the smell of burning thatch. But when the knight slipped a signet ring into his palm, the child inexplicably whispered, "Papa wore this when the ships came." Even more extraordinary were the cases where siblings found each other. Two brothers separated during the fall of Constantinople were reunited in a Hungarian marketplace when one recognized the other's laugh, a sound unchanged since their days chasing geese along the Golden Horn. A girl sold to a Sicilian silk merchant as a toddler was identified decades later by her sister, who spotted the unique braiding pattern of her hair, a style their grandmother had taught them. These weren't just miracles, they were rebellions against oblivion, proof that war couldn't erase every tether between hearts. But for every child who found their way home, countless others lived out their lives as strangers to themselves. A boy raised in a lord's stable might never know he was born to a Welsh chieftain. A girl serving ale in a tavern could have been a duke's stolen heir. The cruelty wasn't just in the loss, it was in the silence, the questions that hung like fog over entire lifetimes. When an elderly monk in Burgundy confessed on his deathbed that he'd been taken from a riverside village as a child, his final wish was bittersweet. "Tell them I tried to remember." What makes these stories so piercing is their unfinished quality. Unlike the triumphant homecomings of knights or merchants, the fates of most lost children remained, and still remain, open wounds. Their lives whisper to us from the margins of history, a reminder that war's true cost isn't just counted in battles, but in the countless ordinary miracles that never happened. The cradle songs unsung, the hands never held, the names that vanished like mist at dawn. And yet when against all odds a scrap of memory survived, those were the moments that turned history's ledger on its head, proving that even the smallest light could outlast the longest night. In the shadow of castles and chronicles, where history often forgets to look, there lived a family whose names no scribe ever wrote down, a peasant clan from the Loire Valley, scattered like seeds in a storm. The year was 1348 when the horsemen came, their torches turning thatch to smoke, their swords cutting the threads that bound parents to children. The father, a wheat farmer named Henry, was dragged off to bolster some lord's army. His wife, Marie, fled into the woods with their 3 daughters, only to lose them in the chaos, one snatched by slavers, another vanishing into a crowd of refugees, the youngest carried away by a kindly nun who feared the girl wouldn't survive the winter. In a single afternoon, 5 lives were hurled to the winds. What followed wasn't just a story of survival, but of memory's stubborn flame. Marie, now a washerwoman in a distant town, refused to let go of the fragments of her past. Every evening, she sang the lullaby she'd crooned to her girls, "Sleep beneath the willow where the river hums low," hoping the melody might reach them like a whispered spell. Meanwhile, her eldest daughter, Elina, enslaved in a Marseille brothel, taught the same song to the other captive girls, as if keeping it alive might tether her to home. The youngest, little Perrine, now an orphanage ward in Normandy, hummed it while scrubbing floors, though she'd forgotten why the tune made her chest ache. Then came the miracle, stitched together by chance and tradition. Years later, at a harvest fair near Chartres, a traveling minstrel performed a ballad that made Marie drop her basket of linens. The refrain was her lullaby, but with new verses, ones that spoke of a mother's hand stained with river mud. She'd never told anyone about washing clothes in the Loire at dawn. Trembling, she followed the musician to a tavern where he confessed he'd learned the song from a woman in Marseille. That thread led her to Elina, who'd been freed when her captor died of plague. Together, they tracked the song's path north, where a Benedictine monk recalled a red-haired novice singing it years prior. The final reunion came on a muddy road outside Rouen. Perrine, now a grown woman with children of her own, heard a familiar voice calling her name, not the one she'd used for decades, but the pet name only her mother knew, Little Frog. The recognition wasn't in faces weathered by time, but in the stories they'd carried like hidden treasures. Marie produced a chipped wooden spoon she'd kept all those years, the one Perrine had stolen as a toddler to dig in the garden. Elina showed the scar on her knee from the day they'd fled, when she'd tripped over a root, and Perrine, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a smooth riverstone, the last thing her mother had pressed into her hand before the nun whisked her away. This wasn't just a family coming back together, it was the triumph of oral history over oblivion. In a world where peasants left no letters, no portraits, no official records, their lives were etched in shared songs and folktales. That lullaby passed through slavers, minstrels, and strangers became a lifeline woven through the chaos. While kings and knights filled chronicles with their exploits, this family's reunion never made the pages. But in the end, it didn't need to. Their story was written in the way Marie's gnarled fingers suddenly remembered how to braid Elina's hair just so, in the way Perrine's children laughed with the same hiccup as their long-lost aunt. The ordinary, it turns out, can be extraordinary, not because it's rare, but because it persists quietly against every odd. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. History isn't just the grand battles or the crowned heads. Sometimes it's a half-remembered song humming in the dark, waiting to lead its singers home. Amid the wreckage of war, where kingdoms crumbled and borders shifted like sand, one institution stood as a beacon of stability, the medieval church. More than just a spiritual sanctuary, monasteries and cathedrals became the nerve centers of hope for shattered families. Their scriptoriums didn't just copy Bibles, they meticulously recorded the names of the living and dead, their ledgers transforming into the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a missing persons bureau. A friar in Burgundy might note the arrival of a wounded soldier from Flanders, while an abbess in Normandy kept a list of orphaned children, their origins guessed from dialects or the embroidery on their ragged clothes. Consider Brother Aldrich of Cluny, a monk whose life's work defied the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Traveling between battlefields with ink-stained fingers, he collected not relics of saints, but fragments of identities, a soldier's description of his village oak tree, a mother's tearful account of her son's birthmark. His innovation was as simple as it was revolutionary. He had scribes copy these details onto scrolls, then sent duplicates to every major abbey in Christendom. One such scroll, now brittle with age, survives in the Vatican archives. It describes a boy taken by mercenaries in 1406. Blue eyes, scar above the left brow, knows the rhyme of Saint Agnes's well. Decades later, a baker in Cologne heard his apprentice humming that very rhyme, a lullaby from a village 200 miles away. The boy, now a man, had been sold twice over, but the church's paper trail outlasted the chains. Relics played a role no one could have predicted. When physical descriptions failed, families turned to objects charged with meaning. A pilgrim might arrive at Santiago de Compostela, clutching a child's baby tooth wrapped in cloth, begging clerics to display it among the saint's bones, hoping a parent would recognize the peculiar notch on its edge. In Lincoln Cathedral, a battered shoe sat in a glass case for centuries, donated by a widow who swore her husband had worn it thin walking to Mass every Sunday. "Let it stand before God," she insisted, "so he may guide his feet home." The shoe never found its owner, but the act itself became a kind of prayer, a testament to the lengths people would go to bridge the chasm of war. The Church's greatest power, though, lay in its universality. A peasant fleeing Burgundy could find sanctuary in a Bavarian cloister, knowing the Latin hymns would sound the same. This shared language of faith created a web of connections stretching across warring kingdoms. Abbots traded letters like chess moves, maneuvering information across enemy lines. When young Elina of Provence vanished during a siege, her family had her name recited in masses from Paris to Rome, a living wanted poster woven into liturgy. Years later, a priest in Aragon recognized her from the description in his breviary. A maiden who stutters when frightened, as she did when the dove startled her at Pentecost. Not all these efforts ended in triumph. For every family reunited, countless others left offerings at altars that never yielded miracles. But in a world where war turned men into ghosts, the Church refused to let them vanish completely. Its archives, its rituals, its very walls whispered the same stubborn message: you are not forgotten. And sometimes, when the stars aligned just right, that whisper became a shout echoing across time to reunite a mother with her child, a wife with her husband, stitching the torn fabric of lives back together with threads of ink and faith. The candle in Elina of Aquitaine's chamber had burned down to a nub when the knock came 3 short raps, the signal she'd whispered to her husband 2 decades earlier as he rode off to the Holy Land. 20 years, 20 winters of spinning wool by the same window, 20 summers of turning away suitors who insisted no Crusader could survive so long. The local bishop had pressed her to declare Raymond dead and remarry for the sake of her lands. Her own brother offered her hand to a Flemish count in exchange for armies. Still, she kept the candle lit, because when Raymond had kissed her goodbye in 1191, he'd made no grand speeches about glory, just pressed his forehead to hers and promised, "However long it takes, however far I walk, I will find my way back to this door." That promise had carried him through hell. Captured after the fall of Acre, he'd spent 7 years hauling stones for a Saracen fortress until a sympathetic guard, a father himself, helped him escape. With no money or weapons, he walked barefoot toward the coast, trading labor for passage on a Genoese ship. Pirates seized the vessel off Cyprus, forcing him to fight as a galley slave until a storm shattered their chains. By the time he reached Venice, his hair was white, his back scarred from lashings, but he still carried the pilgrim's badge Elina had pinned to his cloak, a tiny silver scallop shell, now black with age. Meanwhile, back in Poitou, Elina had become a different kind of warrior. She'd learned to read estate ledgers, to argue law with barons who thought a woman couldn't manage lands alone. When bandits raided her vineyards, she organized the peasants into a militia. When the bishop threatened to annul her marriage by decree, she produced a letter from Rome affirming her rights. The court scribes called her the Steel Rose, a widow who refused to wear black, who still set 2 places at her table every feast day. Their reunion defied every troubadour's fantasy. Raymond didn't burst into the hall like a conquering hero. He limped through the kitchen gate, mistaken at first for a beggar. The cook nearly turned him away until he spoke the name of Elina's childhood pony, a secret only a husband would know. When Elina rushed downstairs, she didn't find the golden-haired knight of her youth, but a gray-bearded stranger with eyes haunted by deserts and dungeons. The moment hung between them, fragile as glass, until Raymond reached into his tunic and produced the scallop shell, now strung on a cord beside his heart. What followed wasn't just a personal miracle, but a quiet revolution, because Elina's steadfastness and Raymond's grueling odyssey shattered the lazy stereotype of medieval women as passive victims waiting for men to define their fates. Here was a wife who defended her autonomy with quill and wit, a husband who'd crossed continents not for gold, but for the woman who remembered how he took his wine. Their story whispers through the cracks of history. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't just about courtly ballads or strategic alliances. Sometimes, against all odds, it was about 2 people stubborn enough to outlast war itself, to stand at life's crossroads 20 years later and say, "You see, I told you I'd wait." The joy of reunion often masked a deeper, more painful truth. Many medieval soldiers didn't just bring home scars on their bodies, but wounds invisible to the eye. Imagine a knight who'd survived a dozen battles, only to flinch at the sound of his own children laughing too loudly, or a peasant conscript who could no longer bear the smell of baking bread. It reminded him of the siege where he'd starved alongside corpses. Today, we'd call this PTSD, but in the Middle Ages, they had no name for the way war could hollow out a man's soul. Chroniclers wrote of veterans who woke screaming about battles fought years prior, or who wandered into the woods at night, searching for fallen comrades only they could see. One account from the Annals Cambrai describes a Welsh archer who, upon returning home, refused to touch a bow again, not out of pacifism, but because the creak of the string made him vomit with remembered terror. Families often found themselves piecing together lives with strangers wearing familiar faces. A wife might reach for her husband in bed only to have him recoil, his instinct still sharpened by years of sleeping with a dagger. Children grew wary of fathers who wept uncontrollably during harvest festivals, the scent of trampled grain transporting them back to fields littered with the dead. Some communities developed their own ways of coping. In northern France, villages held quiet weeks after soldiers returned, muting church bells and keeping dogs tied up to ease the transition. Monasteries offered sanctuary to veterans too shattered for civilian life, their scriptoriums filling with confessions like that of Brother Matthias, a former knight who wrote, "Every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of the men I killed, and worse, the ones I could not save." The guilt of survival cut deeper than any blade. A Burgundian chronicle tells of a shoemaker who'd lost 2 sons in battle, only for the third to return, a reunion that should have been joyous. Instead, the survivor carved his brothers' names into every pair of boots he made, as if stitching his remorse into the leather. Other veterans turned to extreme penance, like the English longbowman who walked barefoot to Jerusalem after accidentally killing a child in a sacked village. Even those who'd committed no atrocities bore the weight of simply having lived. The poet knight Geoffroy de Charny, who literally wrote the book on chivalry, confessed to waking in cold sweats, haunted by the question, "Why did God spare me when better men fell?" For families, the challenge wasn't just healing, it was relearning each other. A Flemish tapestry from the 1500s shows a peculiar scene. A knight seated at a spinning wheel, his wife teaching him to card wool. Art historians believe this depicts a real practice, returning soldiers being gently reintegrated through domestic tasks, a medieval form of occupational therapy. Letters from the period reveal wives strategizing like battlefield commanders. "I leave the plow where he can see it, but say nothing. Let him come to it in his own time." Some communities appointed rememberers, elders who'd sit with veterans and retell stories of their pre-war selves, reforging the broken links of identity. The cruelest irony, many soldiers found peace only by returning to war. The Teutonic Knights actively recruited veterans struggling at home, offering structure and purpose to men who no longer fit in peacetime. Others became itinerant guards, their hypervigilance now an asset. But for those who stayed, the path to healing was slow and often silent. The archaeologist who discovered a 15th century farmhouse in Sussex noticed something odd. The floorboards near the hearth were gouged with knife marks. Only later did they realize these were tally cuts, likely made by a soldier counting off the days since his last nightmare, a private calendar of survival carved into wood instead of skin. These stories force us to confront a truth we often gloss over in tales of reunion. Coming home wasn't an ending, but another kind of battle. The medieval world had no therapists or support groups, only the stubborn love of those who refused to give up on their broken warriors. And perhaps that's the most profound reunion of all, not the dramatic embrace at the gate, but the daily courage to say, "I see your scars and I am still here." The lullaby was never meant for anyone's ears but her own, a melody Lady Issebao had hummed to her newborn daughter in the firelit nursery, so softly even the nurses couldn't recall the words. But war cares nothing for private moments. When bandits raided their Yorkshire manor in 1409, Isabel's husband fell defending the gates, and their 2-year-old girl vanished into the chaos, presumed stolen or worse. For 15 years, the lady kept the song locked in her heart, singing it only when the grief grew too heavy, her voice trembling over the notes like a moth circling a dying flame. Until one midsummer evening, when a traveling minstrel set up his lute in the castle courtyard and began to play. The musician had learned the tune from a wool merchant's wife in Lincoln, who'd heard it from a tanner's daughter in Nottingham, a chain of borrowed memory stretching back years. But when Issebao froze mid-step, her wine cup slipping from her fingers, it wasn't just the melody that struck her. It was the second verse, the one she'd improvised the night her daughter was born. "Sleep beneath the rowan tree where the silver starlight weaves." No one outside that nursery could have known those words. Art in the Middle Ages wasn't just entertainment, it was a lifeline. Minstrels carried more than songs, they were living archives of vanished lives. A ballad about a knight's lost love might contain coded clues to his whereabouts. A drinking tune from Burgundy could help a homesick mercenary prove his origins. In this case, the lullaby had become a beacon, passed from lips to lips until it circled back to the one person who recognized its true meaning. Isabel's hands shook as she pressed gold into the minstrel's palm, begging every detail. The trail led to a bustling market town where a red-haired girl, now a woman, sold ribbons and sang to herself while working. The reunion was anything but the stuff of ballads. Marjorie, as she was now called, had no memory of the raid. Raised by a childless weaver who'd bought her from slavers, she'd spent years dismissing the lullaby as a dream. When Issebao knelt before her stall, whispering the forgotten nickname, Little Wren, Marjorie recoiled. Love at first sight belongs to fairy tales. Real healing takes time. It was only when Issebao sang the third verse, the one about the foxgloves by the gate, that Marjorie's breath caught. "I've always hated foxgloves," she admitted. "They make my chest ache, but I never knew why." The minstrel's role in this drama didn't end there. Recognizing the power of his art, he composed The Lady's Lament, a ballad that spread across England, inspiring other families to share their own melodies in hopes of finding the lost. A Durham monastery began keeping a ledger of such songs, matching fragments brought by travelers. In Essex, a baker's son was identified by the nonsense rhyme his father had invented to teach him numbers. These weren't just reunions, they were revolutions in how ordinary people weaponized culture against oblivion. Marjorie never fully reclaimed her past. The girl who'd slept beneath rowan trees was gone. In her place stood a pragmatic merchant who preferred city life to castles. But when she bore her first child, Issebao was there, teaching the babe the same lullaby, now with a new verse added. Remember, oh remember, how the broken threads may mend. The minstrel, watching from the doorway, plucked a quiet chord on his lute. Some stories don't need endings, they just need to keep singing. The law in medieval Europe could be as merciless as any battlefield. For families torn apart by war, the greatest obstacle wasn't always distance or silence. It was the iron grip of feudal obligations. A serf bound to his lord's land couldn't chase rumors of a missing child across kingdoms, not when abandoning his plot meant forfeiting his home and risking branding as a runaway. A wife declared a widow by royal decree might be pressured into remarrying to secure her protection, only for her first husband to return years later, very much alive. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were collisions between human longing and a legal system that treated people as property. Take the case of Robert of Lincoln, recorded in the court rolls of 1324. After vanishing at the Battle of Boroughbridge, his lands were reassigned to a rival knight, and his wife, Agnes, was ordered to wed the new lord for the good of the estate. When Robert stumbled home 3 years later, having survived as a prisoner in Scotland, he found another man sleeping in his bed and ploughing his fields. The local sheriff ruled in favor of the new husband, declaring, "A man dead in law is dead in fact." Robert's desperate appeal to the king's court went unanswered. The crown had already collected the marriage tax. Even nobility wasn't immune. When Lady Joanna de Bohun returned from a 6-year captivity in France, she discovered her husband had obtained an annulment, claiming abandonment, and now held her dowry lands through a politically advantageous remarriage. The Archbishop's court sympathized but ruled against her, citing a chilling precedent. A wife's duty is to remain where her lord husband places her. Joanna spent the rest of her days as a guest in her own castle, watching another woman raise her children. The cruelest twist, some returning soldiers found themselves punished for surviving. In 1402, a group of English archers declared dead at Agincourt reappeared to find their families evicted, their cottages given to replacements who'd fought in later battles. The law saw no paradox. Vacant holdings were a threat to military readiness. One archer, John Thatcher, was recorded in the rolls of Essex as having no recourse but the charity of the parish, his legal existence erased by a clerk's pen years earlier. These conflicts exposed a fundamental tension in medieval society, the clash between the cold machinery of power and the messy reality of human bonds. Church courts occasionally intervened, like the bishop who dissolved a second marriage upon a soldier's return, ruling, "No vow can undo a sacrament." But more often, the law favored stability over justice. A wife forced to choose between her returned first husband and the father of her new children faced an impossible dilemma, one that left no winners. As the chronicler Thomas Walsingham lamented, "War breaks bodies, but law breaks hearts twice over." Yet even here, glimmers of defiance shone through. Some communities developed quiet workarounds, like the Sussex village that hid a returned serf for years, pretending he was a cousin from another shire. In Brittany, widows pressured into remarriage would secretly leave a candle burning in their original wedding rings, a silent signal to any husband who might come home. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were proof that even in the face of rigid systems, people found ways to whisper, "You still matter." The law might call a man dead, but love refused to sign the decree. Sir Everard de Vaux returned to his family estate in the spring of 1387, a changed man, his once golden hair now streaked with grey, his right hand missing 2 fingers from a Saracen blade. The villagers who'd cheered his departure for the Crusades 19 years earlier barely recognized the gaunt figure limping up the road, but the real shock came when he reached the gates of his own castle. The steward, a man who'd been a boy when Everard left, barred his entry with a pike. "Prove you're not some beggar spinning tales," he demanded. It was the cruelest irony, surviving a Damascus dungeon only to be locked out of his life by his own people. Medieval society had no fingerprints or portraits to confirm identity, only fading memories and scarred flesh. Everard's wife, Lady Margaret, had remarried years earlier after receiving word of his death. His sons, raised on stories of their father's heroism, now faced a stranger claiming their inheritance. Even the family priest hesitated, whispering that the man's Latin prayers sounded too French, a lingering effect of captivity among Provençal mercenaries. The court chronicle preserves Margaret's agonizing testimony. "His eyes are my husband's, but the light in them is foreign." The legal battle that followed exposed the fragility of identity in an age without documentation. Everard's case hinged on intimate details: the childhood burn scar hidden under his tunic, his ability to name every hound in the kennel from his youth. When challenged to describe the tapestries in the Solar, he didn't just list the scenes, he recalled the exact spot where his toddler son had spilled wine on the Hunt of the Unicorn panel. Still, the local baron demanded more, insisting the returned knight perform the sword drills unique to their region. As Everard moved through the forms, his body remembering what his mind had forgotten, his eldest son suddenly burst into tears, recognizing the slight hesitation before the third parry, a quirk his father had always mocked himself for. Even then, the shadows lingered. The second husband refused to relinquish Margaret's dowry lands, producing a royal writ declaring Everard legally dead. For months, the knight lived as a guest in his own hall, watching another man sit in his chair while servants addressed him as "good stranger." The breakthrough came when a traveling physician examined Everard's teeth, finding the distinctive gap where a Damascus jailer had knocked out a molar, the same gap described in a letter the local abbot had archived years earlier. Only then did the court relent, though the records note they charged Everard a resurrection tax for the privilege of reclaiming his name. This wasn't just one man's ordeal. It was a mirror held up to medieval Europe's deepest fears. In a world where war could erase a person as completely as fire consumed parchment, identity became a fragile performance. Returning soldiers often faced suspicion for knowing too much or too little, their very survival seeming improbable. A Florentine merchant's diary captures the paranoia. "Better a known ghost than a living stranger wearing your brother's face." For Everard, the true battle began after the verdict. Relearning his lands meant deciphering 19 years of changed new field rotations, unfamiliar vassals, a wife who'd built a life without him. The chronicles say he never slept in the Lord's chamber again, preferring a smaller room near the stables. But every morning at dawn, he'd walk the battlements with his rediscovered sons, pointing out where the apple trees he'd planted as a youth now stretched their gnarled branches over the wall. A quiet testament that some roots, no matter how strained, never truly let go. When the real world offered no answers, medieval families turned to the unseen dreams that carried messages like smuggled letters from God. In an age where every rustling leaf might hide a sign, the sleeping mind became a battleground for hope. A mother in Normandy swore she saw her missing son standing in a field of blue flowers, only to learn years later he'd been indentured to a Flemish dyer working with woad. A widow in York dreamed of her husband drowning in a river with reeds tangled around his legs. When merchants finally brought news of his death, it was near a marsh known for its tall grasses. These weren't mere coincidences to medieval people, they were proof the divine intervened in the cracks of despair. Saints played messengers in this shadowy correspondence. The cult of Saint Anthony, patron of lost things, overflowed with vows from desperate parents. One parish record describes a woman leaving her infant swaddling cloth at his shrine, praying for a vision. 3 nights later, she dreamed of a marketplace where a woman bundled in green fed a child with a distinctive birthmark, a strawberry smudge shaped like a cross. The description matched a slave trader's route through Marseille. By the time she tracked down the buyer, the child had been resold twice, but the trail of green-clad women led her to a wool merchant's household where her son, now 6, was scrubbing pots. When she produced the swaddling cloth as proof, the merchant's wife fainted she'd kept it as a curiosity, tucked in a chest with other oddities. Miracles walked hand in hand with medicine. A knight's wife in Aquitaine, driven half-mad by years of silence, drank a tonic of vervain and mugwort prescribed by a wise woman to open the eyes of sleep. That night, she saw her husband chained in a seaside cave, gulls circling above. The next morning, she sold her jewels to fund a search of coastal cliffs. What she found wasn't her husband, but a Spanish fisherman who'd seen such a captive in Algiers. The chain of visions and chants led her to a ransom broker, and eventually to a broken man who no longer remembered his own name until she sang the bawdy tavern song they danced to on their wedding night. Not all omens brought comfort. A chronicle from Lincolnshire tells of a father who ignored his daughter's nightmare, a black dog dragging her brother into a river. Weeks later, the boy's body washed ashore near a mill known for its dangerous currents. The account ends with the chilling line, "God sends warnings to those who dare listen." This duality haunted medieval minds. Was every dream a potential clue, or just the mind's cruel trickery? Some families became reluctant scholars of symbolism, passing their nights like ancient texts. A shepherd's wife in the Alps kept a dream ledger, noting that visions of keys meant false hopes while apples signaled truth. When her long-lost son returned with an apple-shaped scar on his cheek, the village declared it proof of heaven's handwriting. The church walked a delicate line, blessing certain visions as divine while condemning others as demonic illusions. A Breton monk's diary reveals the tension. He counseled a weeping woman to disregard her dream of a son in a Saracen turban, only to later discover the boy had indeed converted to Islam in captivity. The incident shook him enough to scribble in the margins, "Are we so proud to think God only speaks Latin?" Perhaps the most poignant miracles were the quiet ones, the exhausted mother who collapsed at a roadside shrine and woke certain her child was alive, the veteran who followed a recurring dream of 3 oak trees to the very village where his sister had resettled. These stories endure not because they defy logic, but because they remind us how fiercely love clings to any thread, even those woven from moonlit mist. In a world where war scattered lives like dice, dreams became the one game where even the poorest could roll for hope, and sometimes against every odd, the heavens tipped the board. The village of St. Julian had long since given up on the Leclerc brothers. 2 years had passed since the battle at Agincourt, 2 years of empty chairs at the harvest feast, 2 years of their mother lighting twin candles at Mass. Then, on a morning so ordinary the baker forgot to bless the bread, the impossible happened. First came Pierre, limping down the road with a Templar's cloak draped over his shoulders, his left arm hanging useless from a wound gone sour. The villagers wept as he embraced his mother, her hands fluttering over his face like moths drawn to a flame they thought extinguished. No one noticed the second figure approaching until the blacksmith's son shouted, a sunburned man with a pilgrim's staff, his beard streaked with grey that hadn't been there when he left. Jacques had last seen his brother pinned under a warhorse, the English arrows falling like black rain. Pierre had watched Jacques take a mace to the chest before darkness claimed him. Neither knew the other had been dragged from that bloody field, Pierre by a band of mercenaries who needed a scribe, Jacques by Franciscan monks who mistook his twitching fingers for signs of life. Their journeys home could not have been more different. Pierre had bought his freedom with forged letters, creeping across Normandy disguised as a leper. Jacques had walked barefoot from a Spanish monastery, following the stars his father once taught him to name. Yet somehow, against every cruel twist of fate, their boots hit the same muddy road on the same golden morning. The celebration that night would be remembered for generations. Farmers brought casks of cider hidden since the English raids. The widow Fournier slaughtered her last pig, declaring, "No feast is too great for resurrection." But amid the dancing and ale, the brothers sat apart, their shoulders touching for the first time since childhood, their silence louder than the revelry. Survivor's guilt is a modern term for an ancient wound. Jacques kept seeing the face of the squire who died giving him a sip of water. Pierre woke gasping from dreams of the French knight who'd taken his place in the prisoner's line, a man who now mouldered in an unmarked grave while he ate plum cake in his mother's kitchen. What saved them wasn't time or talk, but the stubborn love of their village. Old Martine, the midwife who'd birthed them, pressed a knife into each brother's hand and made them carve their names into the oak by the well, a ritual usually reserved for newborns. "The tree remembers what men forget," she croaked. The blacksmith's daughter, who'd lost 3 sons to the same war, began calling them God's reckoning, refusing to let them apologize for living. Even the priest broke tradition, reading not from the Psalms but from the farmer's almanac. A field left fallow is not dead, only gathering strength for the next sowing. By winter, the brothers had built a chapel on the hill where they'd first spotted each other. It had no saint's statue, just 2 crude carvings of soldiers, one holding a quill, the other a pilgrim's shell. The villagers came not to pray for miracles, but to remember their own missing. Jacques would ring the bell at dawn. Pierre would tally the names whispered by visitors in a ledger that grew thicker each month. Some might call it penance. They called it keeping promises not to the dead, but to the living who still needed their hands in the world. And when the wind howled through the chapel door, it sounded almost like laughter. The kind 2 boys might share, racing home through the twilight, certain they'd beaten the dark. In the flickering light of a medieval hearth where parchment was scarce and literacy a privilege, families stitched their memories into the very fabric of daily life. A mother's trembling fingers might embroider her son's initials onto a tunic hem, not as decoration but as a silent prayer, "Let this thread outlast the distance." A father would press his signet ring into warm wax, leaving behind not just a legal seal, but the ridges and walls of his fingerprint, a tactile memory for children who might outgrow his face. These weren't mere objects, they were lifelines cast across the chasm of war, each knot an engraving a defiance against forgetting. Consider the Bayeux tapestry of the poor, those countless unrecorded cloths woven in cottages rather than castles. A surviving example, discovered in a Swiss monastery's reliquary, shows a crude but heartbreaking scene. A woman and child standing by a willow tree, their outlines frayed from years of touch. The stitches, uneven and hurried, suggest it was made in a single night, perhaps as a departing soldier's keepsake. but the real revelation lies in the border, where tiny knots form a pattern only recognizable to one familiar with the family's secret. When a wounded mercenary returned to a Bavarian village decades later, his sister knew him instantly, not by his scarred face, but by the way his fingers traced those knots in the exact sequence their mother had taught them. Like this, he whispered, demonstrating the old mending technique. 3 loops under, then over. The cloth, tucked in a chest all those years, became their shared language when words failed. Rings served as more than jewelry, they were portable archives. A gold band found in a Danish bog bears an inscription too faint for the naked eye. Ulf left in spring. Worn smooth by a wife's thumb, the words were never meant for outsiders. They were a tactile reminder, read by touch alone during long absences. In one remarkable case from York, a knight returning from the Crusades proved his identity not by recounting battles, but by describing the hidden compartment in his father's ring, a space so small it held only a single strand of his sister's hair, coiled like a secret. Oral genealogies, meanwhile, turned children into living scrolls. Breton peasants trained their young to recite ancestry back 7 generations, not out of pride but necessity. A fragment of a ballad from the Pyrenees tells of a shepherd's daughter who reunited with her captured brother by singing the list of their great-grandparents' names, a sequence no impostor could replicate. "You forgot Tant Ollie's," he corrected hoarsely when a pretender tried, and the village erupted in cheers. The past wasn't just remembered, it was weaponized against loss. The most poignant artifacts, though, were the ones that survived by accident. A cooking pot in a Catalan museum bears scratches along its rim, hash marks counting the days a wife stirred porridge alone. A toddler's leather shoe, excavated from a London cesspit, had initials punched into the sole by a father who feared his child might be stolen. These objects whisper across centuries, reminding us that in an age of uncertainty, people clung to the physical as if it could tether their loved ones to earth. When a Flemish weaver finally embraced the son he'd thought dead, it wasn't the man's face that convinced him, but the way he absent-mindedly rubbed his left thumb against his palm, a childhood habit born from years of spinning flax. Memory, it seems, lies not just in the mind, but in the hands, the voice, the very weave of a thread held tight against the storm. The chapel bells in Cluny had long since tolled for Elaine de Bures, or so the village believed. When the young knight failed to return from the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, his betrothed, Issebao, was urged to take the veil. Grief is a guest that overstays its welcome. The local priest chided, pressing her toward a nunnery. But Issebao kept Elaine's dagger tucked in her girdle, its hilt wrapped with a lock of his hair, and every May Day she left a sprig of hawthorn on his family's tomb, not as mourning, but as a dare to fate. 10 years passed. Issebao, now a skilled illuminator in the abbey scriptorium, was sketching a psalter when a commotion erupted in the courtyard. A group of ragged pilgrims had arrived, one leaning heavily on a staff, his face obscured by a hood. Something about the angle of his shoulders made her quill hesitate. Then the wind caught his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar running from wrist to elbow, the mark Elaine had earned at 17, falling from the very oak where they'd first kissed. The scar told only half the story. Captured by English forces, Elaine had spent years laboring in a Cornish tin mine before escaping to a Breton monastery. A bout of fever erased chunks of his memory, including his own surname. What remained was a hazy recollection of a girl who painted flowers in the margins of books, and the inexplicable urge to carve hawthorn branches into every surface he touched. It wasn't until a traveling friar mentioned Cluny's famous illuminators that the fragments aligned. Their reunion shattered every convention. Medieval betrothals were contracts, not love stories, and a decade's absence normally voided any pact. Yet when Issebao pressed Elaine's hand to the dagger's hilt, the hair now grey but still entwined, the abbess herself intervened, declaring, "God writes no accident this plain." The real miracle wasn't his survival, but the way Issebao's stubborn love had preserved a space for him in a world that demanded she move on. The wedding portrait they commissioned tells the rest. Unlike the stiff poses of noble couples, Elaine and Issebao are depicted mid-laugh, their hands clasped over that scar, a hawthorn sprig tucked behind his ear. In the corner, the artist included an inside joke, a tiny margin doodle of a nun scowling at a dagger, because sometimes the most radical act in medieval Europe wasn't defiance, but patience, the quiet refusal to let go, even when the whole world insisted you should. The ransom demand arrived on vellum so fine it crackled like winter leaves, 50 gold florins for the return of Henry, a blacksmith's son taken at the Battle of Nicopolis. His mother, a widow who spun flax until her fingers bled, calculated the sum allowed, 2 decades' wages, more than the value of their cottage and forge combined. She sold everything but her distaff, the tool she'd used to teach Henry to spin thread as a child, clinging to it as if the worn wood could weave him back home. Meanwhile, in a Florentine palazzo, merchant Lorenzo di Rixai dispatched his private secretary with a purse heavy enough to buy 3 prisoners, one of them his nephew, the other 2 random Frenchmen chosen because their guild badges matched his dead sister's embroidery. "Why not?" he scribbled in his ledger, "God favors the generous." This was the brutal arithmetic of medieval reunions. Hope had a price tag, and not all purses were equal. For peasants, even a day's journey to search for missing kin could mean starvation. Court rolls from Normandy tell of a shepherd who walked barefoot to Paris seeking his press-ganged brother, only to return empty-handed when his last coin bought a loaf shared with a stray dog, the only creature who'd listened to his story. Contrast this with the Fugger banking family, who funded a network of informants across Europe, their letters flying along courier routes faster than plague. A single memo from their Augsburg headquarters could set a dozen agents scouring Venetian slave markets or Cypriot wine cellars for a missing heir. Dowries became particularly cruel hurdles. When Jeanne de Clermont's husband vanished during the Albigensian Crusade, her father-in-law seized her marriage portion, declaring her neither wife nor widow, a limbo that left her begging at abbey gates. Years later, when her scarred but very alive husband stumbled into her village, the legal battle to reclaim her dowry dragged on until their children were grown. Meanwhile, wealthy widows like Elina of Castile could hire canon lawyers to freeze estates indefinitely, their coffers buying time that poorer women burned in desperation. The ransom system epitomized this imbalance. Kings and nobles had professional negotiators, men like William de la Pole, who brokered the release of Charles of Blois for the staggering sum of 700,000 crowns. But when common soldiers were captured, their families faced grotesque choices. A tax record from Burgundy shows a butcher's wife who sold her twin daughters into servitude to free their father, only for him to die en route home. The girls spent their lives scrubbing floors in a count's kitchen, their mother's name scratched into the hearthstone where they'd whisper it at night. Yet even wealth couldn't guarantee success. The Medici archives preserve the agonizing correspondence of Giovanni Tornabuoni, who spent fortunes hunting his missing son across the Levant. His agents bribed Ottoman jailers, interviewed Armenian spice traders, even commissioned a fake astrological prophecy to spook a rival into releasing information. After 12 years, they found Lorenzo not in some dungeon, but thriving as a physician in Damascus, having assumed a new identity to escape his family's debts. The reunion lasted precisely one awkward dinner before Lorenzo slipped back into the night, leaving his father to mourn a different kind of loss, perhaps the starkest disparity lay in memorials. While merchants endowed chapels with stained glass depicting their returned kin kneeling before saints, peasants recycled grief into daily objects. Archaeologists find heartbreaking adaptations: a Yorkshire cooking pot with names scratched along the rim like a rosary, a Breton loom weighted with stones painted to resemble absent faces. These weren't just mementos, they were balance sheets of the heart, where the cost of remembrance was measured in stolen moments between dawn chores and dusk prayers. The ledger of reunion, it turns out, had two columns, one for those who could buy back their loved ones, and another for those who paid in pieces of themselves. And somewhere between them, in the smudged margins of history, lies the quiet truth that no amount of gold could heal every wound, but its absence could break even the strongest bonds. The woman who stumbled into Matilda's herb-scented hut bore no resemblance to the girl she'd once known. Her face was gaunt from hunger, her hands calloused from labor in some far-off lord's fields. But when the stranger unwrapped her bundle to reveal a twist of dried yellow flowers, the herbalist's breath caught. "Lady's heart," she whispered, touching the brittle petals reverently. No one outside their valley used this remedy, not for fever, not for childbirth pains. The recipe was a guarded secret, passed mother to daughter along the rocky slopes of the Pyrenees. And the last person Matilda had taught it to was little Aveline, the miller's daughter, vanished when raiders torched their village a decade prior. War scattered knowledge as ruthlessly as it did families. In an era before printed manuals, healing traditions lived in muscle memory, the exact pressure for grinding juniper berries, the precise moment to harvest moonwort before dawn. Aveline, barely 12 when taken, had clung to these lessons like lifelines. Her captors mocked her for chewing willow bark to ease their headaches, until the day her poultice saved a chieftain's infected leg. Freedom came slowly, first as a trusted slave, then as a wandering healer trading skills for scraps. All those years, she'd carried Lady's heart in her satchel like a compass, its bitter scent the only map she had to guide her home. Matilda's recognition was more than chance, it was a testament to how deeply war could bury identity, and how fiercely the ordinary could resist. While nobles identified kin by coats of arms or Latin mottos, peasants relied on the quiet markers of daily survival. A baker's son might be known by the way he shaped loaf scars on bread, a weaver's daughter by the particular hitch in her spindle rhythm. For Aveline, it was the way she tied herb bundles, 3 clockwise twists of twine, just as Matilda had shown her beside the creek where watercress grew wild. The reunion that followed was less a single moment than a slow unraveling of silence. At first, Aveline could only stare at the herbalist's hands, those same capable fingers that had once pressed yarrow to her skinned knee. Then came the flood of questions. Did the old oak by the mill still stand? Had anyone found her mother's copper bracelet in the ashes? When Matilda produced a charred but recognizable wooden doll from her chest, the one Aveline had dropped while fleeing, the dam broke. Neighbors who'd long assumed the girl dead wept to hear her describe the exact pattern of moss on the chapel's north wall, a detail no outsider could invent. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the reunion, but what it reveals about medieval resilience. In a world where official records ignored the poor, where wars erased whole lineages without a scribe's notice, survival often hinged on unremarkable skills. The way a mother's stew simmered, the particular stitch a shepherd used to mend his cloak. When Aveline finally embraced her surviving brother, now a charcoal burner with eyes just like their father's, it wasn't grand gestures that convinced him, but the way she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her left ear, a habit born from years of keeping curls away from open flames. The villagers rebuilt Aveline's family mill within the year, its new stones grinding grain to the rhythm of her childhood lullabies. and though she'd learned a dozen foreign remedies in her exile, it was Lady's heart that hung dried above the hearth, a golden reminder that sometimes the humblest knowledge could outlast fire and sword. Long after kings' names faded from memory, the scent of those yellow flowers still whispered to anyone who knew how to listen. No one is truly lost while the earth remembers their hands. The firelight in a medieval hall didn't just cast shadows, it conjured ghosts. When the wind howled through the shutters and the embers dimmed, families whispered of the Droc Fuel, the wandering soldier, a spectral figure said to knock thrice on the doors of those who'd lost kin to war. These weren't just campfire tales, they were the desperate poetry of a world where countless souls vanished without graves. In villages from Scotland to Sicily, people told of armored figures seen at crossroads, their faces obscured by mist, offering silent nods before dissolving at dawn. Some claimed these apparitions carried tokens: a rusted dagger, a child's wooden toy, proof they'd come not to haunt but to heal. The folklore cut deeper than mere superstition. For every family reunited in this life, 100 others clung to stories like the White Horseman of Lombardy, where a slain knight returned each winter solstice to embrace his orphaned son one last time. Chroniclers recorded sightings with startling specificity. A Breton widow swore her husband's ghost repaired their fence every autumn, keeping a promise he'd made before marching off. A monastic diary from Burgundy describes a boy leading a blind beggar to his mother's cottage, only for her to recognize the man's cough as her long-dead father's. These accounts blurred the line between hallucination and miracle, giving shape to grief when no body could be buried. What makes these legends so piercing is their tenderness. Unlike vengeful spirits of Gothic lore, medieval revenants often came to complete rather than frighten. The annals of Ulster tell of a fisherman whose drowned brother appeared not as a dripping corpse, but dry and smiling, to teach the man's daughter how to mend nets the way our father showed us. In Lincolnshire, parents left windows unlatched on stormy nights, hoping their lost children might slip in as thistledown ghosts, weightless beings who'd nestled briefly in their old beds before first light. These weren't macabre fantasies, but acts of radical imagination. If war stole the chance for goodbye, folklore would invent one. The church's stance wavered between tolerance and terror. While priests condemned necromancy, they quietly blessed dream pillows stuffed with rosemary and mugwort, said to invite benevolent visits from the departed. A 13th century bishop's ledger even lists a payment to a carpenter for a chair left always empty, a seat reserved for a missing son's spirit at family meals. This tension birthed peculiar hybrids of faith and folklore, like the Welsh tradition of Ysbrydion Cariad, love ghosts, where couples separated by war would each keep half a carved apple. If both halves rotted at the same rate, it meant their bond endured beyond death. Archaeology hints at how deeply these beliefs took root. Excavations of peasant cottages reveal oddities: a child's shoe buried beneath the hearthstone, a wedding ring sealed inside a wall, ritual acts meant to tether wandering souls to home. In Essex, a midden yielded a rusted helmet filled with wildflowers, its interior worn smooth from years of being cradled. These weren't just mementos, they were portals. When physical reunion was impossible, people built bridges between worlds with whatever scraps they had. The cruelest twist: some legends suggest the dead themselves resisted closure. A Saxon ballad tells of a mother who begged Saint Michael to stop her son's ghost from chopping phantom firewood outside her door each night. "He thinks I still feel the cold," she wept. In the end, the saint couldn't banish the spirit, only teach the woman to pretend to accept the logs so her son could finally rest. That's the heartrending truth beneath these tales. they weren't just about the dead finding peace, but the living learning to let go. When a Scottish chronicler wrote of a widow who finally sold her husband's plough after his ghost nodded approval, he wasn't recording a haunting. He was documenting the exact moment grief turned its face toward the light. The boy who crawled from the ashes of Hodges Mill had no name when the nuns found him, just blackened clothes and eyes wide with a silence no poultice could heal. The attack that killed his family had stolen his voice along with everything else, leaving him to navigate the world through gestures alone. Years passed in the cloister's scriptorium, where he copied manuscripts with hands that trembled at the sound of clanging metal, his only link to the past a habit of rubbing his thumb and forefinger together when anxious, as if rolling an invisible pebble. The sisters called him Brother Quietus, assuming he'd been born mute, until the day a wool merchant's wife toured the abbey and froze mid-step, her basket tumbling to the flagstones. She was older now, her braids threaded with silver, but the boy, now a man, would have known her anywhere, not by her face, but by the way her hands flew to her mouth, then sketched a frantic shape in the air, 2 fingers drawn down each cheek, then crossed over her heart. A childhood game, their game, the signal they'd invented to find each other in crowded marketplaces, back when the mill still turned and the world made sense. Medieval records brim with words, charters, chronicles, legal depositions, but the reunions that slipped through history's cracks often spoke in different languages. A tap of the foot meant safe in one family, a particular whistle meant come home in another. For this broken pair, it was the pebble gesture that shattered the silence. The sister, Margaret, had spent a decade showing that motion to every orphan and refugee, praying it might spark recognition. When her brother mirrored it back, adding the twist they'd used to mean "I'm scared," she collapsed to her knees. The nun stared as this mute man made a sound for the first time in 15 years, a raw, wordless cry that shook the ivy from the walls. Their story exposes a truth scribes often missed. Survival wasn't always about names or documents. In a Durham monastery's marginalia, there's a sketch of 2 hands forming a bird's shadow, likely a memory aid for separated kin. Icelandic sagas tell of a warrior recognized by the way he cracked his knuckles before drawing a bow. Even the Bayeux tapestry hides such clues in its borders. A woman teaching a child to count on their fingers, a soldier signaling with his shield's tilt. These weren't just details, they were lifelines. Margaret's brother never regained speech, but he didn't need to. When they returned to their rebuilt mill, he communicated with flour-dusted hands, patting dough in the rhythm of their mother's lullabies, tracing maps of their childhood wanderings in spilled grain. At his funeral decades later, villagers noted how his sister clasped her hands in a peculiar way, thumb tucked between 2 fingers, the same shape she'd used to say "I'm here" on that life-changing day in the abbey. A language without words, echoing long after the parchment records of their lives had crumbled to dust, because some bonds don't need ink to endure, just hands that remember what the heart refuses to forget. The body remembers what the mind struggles to hold. In an age before photographs or fingerprints, scars became living parchment, stories etched in flesh that outlasted fading memories. A knight's sword slash across the cheek, a serf's brand from a runaway's capture, the telltale pockmarks of childhood plague. These weren't just wounds, but landmarks on the map of a life. For families torn apart by war, these marks often became the only proof that a stranger at the gate was once their own. Take the case of Martin the Fletcher, recorded in the Chronicles of Rowan. When he limped into his village after 8 years missing at Crecy, his own mother barred the door, not from cruelty but terror. The left side of his face was a ruin of knotted flesh, his ear melted away by Greek fire. It wasn't until he rolled up his sleeve to reveal the old dog bite on his forearm, the one he'd gotten saving his little sister from a mastiff, that the family's disbelief shattered into sobs. The scar had been a boyhood shame, now it was the key to his humanity. Brands told darker tales, runaway serfs bore seared symbols of their lord's dominion, marks meant to chain them even in freedom. Yet in a twist of cruel irony, these very brands sometimes became lifelines. A Flemish weaver's daughter, stolen by slavers as a child, was identified decades later not by her faded memories of home, but by the faded D branded above her elbow, the insignia of the very lord who'd once oppressed her parents. The wound that claimed her freedom ultimately led her back to them. Some scars spoke in silent languages only kin could decipher. A returning Crusader might show his wife not battle wounds, but the barely visible sickle mark on his thigh, proof he was the same man who'd once slipped harvesting barley on their wedding day. A mother in Aragon recognized her son by the way he absent-mindedly rubbed the shiny burn on his wrist, a habit left from the time he'd grabbed her baking peel as a toddler. These weren't just identifiers, they were intimate dialects of the body, spoken in the quiet grammar of shared history. Then there were the scars that hid in plain sight. A Breton ballad tells of a blacksmith's wife who doubted a traveler's claim until he removed his tunic to reveal a birthmark shaped like the yew tree outside their cottage. But the real revelation came when he turned. His back bore the same lattice of old whip marks she'd treated with goose grease every winter. "No two scars cross alike," she whispered, tracing the familiar pattern with trembling fingers. The body, it seemed, kept its own ledger of suffering, yet not all marks led to joyous reunions. The York coroner's rolls note a heartbreaking case where a veteran's distinctive facial scar, a badge of honor from Agincourt, made his corpse the only one identified after a shipwreck. His wife received the body with grim gratitude. At least this time, war had given something back. Other scars carried unbearable weight. A Florentine merchant's diary describes a father collapsing upon seeing his son's branded cheek, not from shock at the injury, but because the mark matched those of the slave galley he'd spent years hunting, only to abandon the search when hope grew too heavy. The paradox of these physical markers was their duality. They could both obscure and reveal, terrify and comfort. A Nuremberg broadsheet from 1492 depicts a chilling scene. A returned soldier frightening children with his ruined face until his aged mother parts his hair to reveal a childhood scar shaped like a crescent moon. The woodcut's caption reads, "The body forgets nothing, even when the world forgets us." Perhaps that's why these stories endure. In a time when war could erase identities as easily as scribes scraped parchment clean, scars became the ink that wouldn't fade. The last stubborn proof that no matter how far someone wandered, their body still knew the way home. The storm that swallowed the Sea Maiden off the coast of Brittany in 1403 wasn't just a tragedy, it was an erasure. No bodies washed ashore, no splintered planks bobbed in the waves, only silence stretching for years. Margaret, the ship's carpenter's wife, wore her grief like a second skin, draping her windows in black and marking each anniversary by tossing a loaf of his favorite rye bread into the harbor. For the fishes, she'd mutter, though everyone knew it was an offering to whatever depths had claimed him. Then, on a morning so ordinary the gulls barely stirred, a figure shuffled into the marketplace with a limp that made the cobblestones tremble. His skin was tanned to leather, his beard streaked with salt, but when he opened his mouth to haggle over mackerel, the fishmonger's knife clattered to the ground. That wasn't just any sailor's accent, it was the peculiar lilt of St. Malo's dockyards, a rhythm no outsider could mimic. Time at sea didn't just weather ships, it sanded men down to their barest edges. Jean the carpenter, if this truly was Jean, spoke in a patchwork of tongues picked up in Tunisian bazaars and Genos brothels, his native Breton peppered with Arabic curses and Portuguese sailing terms. His hands, once calloused from shaping oak beams, now bore the rope burns of a galley slave. The village elders gathered like skeptical crows, demanding proof. "Tell us something only Jean would know," challenged the innkeeper. The stranger responded by humming a tavern song so obscene it hadn't been sung since the old priest's time, then pointed to the ceiling beam where he'd once carved his initials beside a lewd joke. The wood, when examined, revealed not just the carving, but a child's doodle of a three-legged dog hidden beneath it, a secret his son had scratched there years ago. Maritime disappearances were a special kind of purgatory. Unlike battlefields where witnesses might confirm a death, the sea offered no such closure. A man could vanish between one wave and the next, leaving his family stranded between hope and mourning. Records from Bristol's Admiralty Court list cases of widows remarried and estates divided, only for the drowned to stroll back into port a decade later, their very existence now a legal nightmare. One particularly cruel case in Castile saw a returning sailor jailed for impersonating himself. His own sons, now grown, swore their father had been buried at sea after identifying the wrong body in a line of bloated corpses. Yet the sea, for all its cruelty, also forged bonds thicker than blood. Jean's most convincing evidence came not from his past, but his present, the Maltese sailor who'd accompanied him home, a man who'd shared his oar on a Barbary galley. This one, the Maltese grinned, slapping Jean's back, would trade his water ration to sing your Breton lullabies to the stars. The songs he then croaked out, off-key but unmistakable, were the same ones Margaret had whispered to their feverish children. That night, as the village celebrated, the couple sat by the hearth where Jean placed a worn seashell into Margaret's palm, a tiny cowrie she'd tucked into his satchel for luck the day he sailed. The grooves of its surface, polished by years of his thumb worrying at it, had become a map only her fingers could read. For every Jean who stumbled home, 100 more remained ghosts of the tide. But their absence birthed rituals that blurred the line between faith and desperation. In Cornwall, wives baked drowned men's cakes shaped like anchors, believing the scent might guide lost husbands ashore. Venetian glassmakers spun delicate ships in bottles as votives, while Norse sagas told of widows who slept with open windows facing the sea, trusting the wind to carry their breath to the missing. These weren't just superstitions, they were the language of a love too stubborn to sink. And when, against all odds, that love was answered, the reunion wasn't just a homecoming, it was a resurrection, salt-crusted and improbable, proving that even the widest oceans couldn't drown every thread of home. The courtroom in medieval Rouen smelled of ink and anxiety the day the woman known only as Widow Marthe dragged a sunburnt stranger before the bailiff. "This is my son," she declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a scythe. The man bore no resemblance to the boy who'd vanished a decade earlier. His hair was darker, his stance too wary, his dialect peppered with Occitan phrases. Yet when Marthe rolled up his left sleeve to reveal a pale, sickle-shaped scar, the scribe's quill hesitated. "He got this at 7 years, she said, pressing a calloused finger to the mark, when he tried to milk our neighbor's bad-tempered goat." The detail was too peculiar to invent, yet too trivial for records, precisely the kind of proof that made medieval courts bend. Legal reunions in the Middle Ages were battles of memory against parchment. With no birth certificates or portraits, courts relied on a patchwork of evidence: birthmarks sworn to by midwives, childhood injuries described by neighbors, even the way a man might hold a spoon. A trial in 14th century Toulouse hinged on whether a returned Crusader's toes were webbed like his father's. In Lincoln, a daughter proved her identity by recalling how her mother had hidden a silver penny in the thatch to pay the Christmas beggar, a secret only the family knew. These weren't just formalities, they were defenses against impostors who preyed on wartime grief, like the notorious false Baldwin, who claimed to be a count back from the Crusades, only to be exposed when his supposed sister noticed he'd forgotten her hatred of almonds. But no testimony carried the weight of a mother's. In 1358, the province court heard the case of Jehannet, a linen weaver who recognized her son by the way his earlobe dimpled when he laughed, a trait no document could record. The bailiff demanded witnesses, but Jehannet simply placed the man's hands on her face and commanded, "Tell me what you felt the night the fever took your sister." His answer, "Your tears were hot as candle wax," shattered the room. Maternal instinct, often dismissed as sentimentality, became admissible evidence when bureaucracy failed. A York ecclesiastical court even ruled that a mother's certainty outweighs the testimony of 3 men, citing biblical precedents like Hannah recognizing Samuel. This tension between cold record-keeping and human intuition played out dramatically in the case of Elina of Burgundy, when a man appeared in 1422 claiming to be her brother, missing since Agincourt. The ducal court demanded proof. He produced a tattered pilgrim's badge and described their childhood home, yet doubts lingered until Elina did something unthinkable. She seized a knife and nicked his thumb. As blood welled, she turned to the judges. "Our father was a butcher," she said. "This one bled just like him, slow and dark." The crude test worked because it tapped into a deeper truth families knew bodies in ways scribes couldn't capture. Yet these victories were bittersweet. For every mother who triumphed in court, countless others faced cruel ironies, like the Breton peasant whose returned son couldn't prove his identity because the village priest who'd recorded his baptism had died in the same war. Some turned to divine intervention. In Montpellier, a judge ordered a claimant and his alleged father to hold a relic while swearing. If either lied, their hands would blacken. When no blight appeared, the court declared it God's verdict. What these stories reveal isn't just medieval legal ingenuity, but the raw resilience of human bonds. Against the impersonal machinery of feudalism, where people were often reduced to tax liabilities or military quotas, families fought to reclaim their own, not through titles or deeds, but through the language of shared scars and half-remembered songs. The law might demand proof, but love required only recognition. That flicker across a mother's face when her grown child absent-mindedly rubs his eyebrow exactly like his father did. In the end, justice wasn't just about documents. It was about the unshakable certainty of a woman who needed no seal or signature to know her own flesh and blood. The road to Santiago de Compostela stretched like a dusty ribbon across the hills, worn smooth by centuries of hopeful feet. Among the weary pilgrims shuffling toward the cathedral's spires walked Bertrand, a Burgundian farmer whose boots held more than blisters. They carried a secret tucked beneath the insole. Not a relic or a coin, but a child's wooden top, its paint chipped from years of fidgeting in his pocket. It had belonged to his daughter, lost when mercenaries raided their village 12 winters past. Like so many medieval pilgrims, Bertrand wasn't just seeking salvation, he was following the oldest trail of crumbs a desperate heart could imagine. The rumor that missing children sometimes surfaced along these holy routes, sold to traveling merchants or indentured to roadside inns. Pilgrimage sites functioned as accidental crossroads for shattered families. The constant flow of humanity, nobles and peasants, soldiers and lepers, created a fragile network where news might travel farther than any messenger. At Rocamadour, where St. Amada's shrine drew thousands, parents would pin scraps of cloth to a miraculous statue, not just as offerings but as signals. A strip of blue wool from a daughter's kirtle, a square of linen embroidered with a family crest. These became silent pleas to the universe. If you've seen this child, speak. The Canterbury Tales fictional reunions paled beside real accounts like that of Marie of Chartres, who found her son serving ale at a hostel near Vigil after recognizing his telltale habit of humming through his teeth, a quirk he'd had since teething. Bertrand's miracle came not at the grand cathedral, but at a humble wayside chapel near Leon. Kneeling before a fresco of St. Christopher, he felt the familiar weight of the top in his pocket and on impulse spun it on the stone floor. The sound of wood on stone drew gasps. A young woman tending votive candles froze, then whispered a word Bert and hadn't heard in over a decade, Tupai. The nickname he'd given the toy for its wild spins. The girl, now a woman with her own child strapped to her back, had been sold to a Catalan merchant, then freed when he died without heirs. She kept the chapel now, lighting candles for parents she barely remembered. When Bertrand showed her the top's secret compartment, where she'd once hidden a stolen cherry pit, her hands flew to her mouth. What makes these pilgrim reunions extraordinary isn't just their improbability, but their layered meaning. For the Church, these were miracles affirming sacred sites' power. For families, they were proof that love could outpace even time's cruel march. A Florentine merchant's diary records his shock at finding his presumed dead brother serving as a translator in Jerusalem's markets. He knew me not by face, but by the way I bit my lip when counting coins, just as our Father taught us. These moments blurred the line between divine intervention and human determination, each reunion a testament to the stubborn belief that no one was truly lost while someone still searched. The Compostela archives preserve Bertrand's testimony alongside thousands of others, not in dry Latin, but in the messy vernacular of joy. His daughter, now called Elina, never returned to Burgundy. She'd built a life at the chapel, marrying a stonecutter who carved their names into the base of St. Christopher's statue. But when Bertrand died years later on a second pilgrimage to see her, he was buried beneath the chapel floor, his bones aligning with the very spot where the top had spun its way back to his heart. The last line of his testament reads simply, "God's roads twist, but they always lead home." And perhaps that's the real lesson of these stories, not that faith guarantees reunion, but that it gives us the courage to keep walking when all other lights go out. These stories of medieval reunions aren't just relics of the past, they're mirrors reflecting the unbreakable human spirit. Think about it. In a world without phones, without maps, without any guarantee that a letter would reach its destination, people still refused to let go. They lit candles that burned for decades, memorized lullabies as if they were maps, and turned scars into proof of love. That's not just history, that's a masterclass in resilience. Take the mother who spun thread from her own grief, or the knight who crossed continents because he remembered the way his wife laughed at a bad joke. These weren't fairy tales, they were ordinary people who did extraordinary things to rewrite endings that seemed set in stone. And isn't that the most surprising lesson? That in an age of plagues and swords, where life could be snatched away in an instant, the most powerful force wasn't fear, it was the stubborn refusal to accept loss as final. What's remarkable is how these echoes still reach us today. Maybe you've never had to identify a loved one by the way they tie their shoes or hum under their breath, but haven't we all clung to some small detail, some shared memory, when distance or time threatened to pull someone away? That's the thread connecting us to those medieval families. Their stories remind us that hope isn't passive, it's a verb. It's the decision to keep asking travelers for news, to carve names into trees, to leave a chair empty at the table just in case. So let me ask you this, which of these reunions stuck with you the most? Was it the merchant following a song across Europe? or the sister who recognized her brother's hands before his face? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment made your heart leap. And if these journeys through history resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Because the past isn't just a collection of dates and battles, it's a living, breathing tapestry of human connection, and we're just getting started unraveling